Clare, you're like me, I suppose, a professional teacher of literature. Why should we still study? Why should young people today still study literature?
You know, I think it's a great question. So it's why English matters, or why the study of literature matters, which is a slightly different thing. I mean, literary texts are great cultural objects, and it's worth studying, you know, great cultural objects because they teach us to be human, I suppose. That's the, you know, it's a humanistic inquiry. They teach us the values of the society that we live in and the values of societies that are now past. They teach us critical thinking. They hone our kind of writing skills. So there's a whole range of reasons why you should study literature. To make yourself articulate, to deepen your cognitive skills, to develop your thinking skills, I suppose.
Well, let's home in a little bit then on what your own work's been about recently. And you've been working on James Joyce's Ulysses, and there's a very substantial study about to appear. You were telling me earlier about the fact that Ulysses was originally published as a serial. Now, I think of Dickens's novels being published as a serial, but this I have to confess was news to me, that Ulysses was published as a serial. Can you start to tell us a little bit about how that happened and what the consequences were?
Yeah, it's quite a fascinating story. Most people think of Ulysses as being published on Joyce's 40th birthday.
By Shakespeare and Company.
Yeah, in Paris. So that's the 2nd of February 1922. But in fact, it first began to be published in the Little Review, which was a New York periodical, or serial, in March 1918. And the person who arranged for the serialisation was Ezra Pound.
My goodness.
So Joyce and Ezra Pound hadn't actually met.
Right.
But Yeats and Pound were friends, and Yeats told Pound, well, you'd like Joyce's work. Yeats and Joyce knew each other from kind of Dublin in the early 1900s. And so Pound wrote and introduced himself and said, you know, I'd like to know more about your work. I've read some of your poems. And they began this kind of epistolary friendship, which developed very quickly into Pound arranging for Joyce's work to be published. So first of all, he arranged for a portrait of the artist as a young man to be serialised in a London journal, which was The Egoist. And as soon as he started to receive as soon as he saw the manuscript of Portrait, he wrote to Joyce and said, you know, I think you are one of the great writers of our generation. And he was incredibly enthusiastic about Joyce's prose. And so, in a sense, Pound became a kind of unofficial agent for Joyce. And he... one of the things that all writers of the era needed was to secure their copyright in America as well as in the UK, because there was a separate kind of set of copyright laws in operation in the US. For a work to secure copyright in the US, it needed to be printed in the US at the time under a thing known as the manufacturing clause. Now, it's not clear that Joyce absolutely understood this, because he kind of buried himself in Trieste and he wasn't really a man to kind of know such details. But Pound certainly did, being American and being in London. And so he arranged for a thing that, you know, technically we could call a dual serialisation. So Ulysses was to be serialised both in The Egoist in London and the Little Review in New York. And he'd worked for some time to get himself the corner of a kind of modernist journal, and eventually he got a corner of the Little Review. He arranged with a philanthropist called John Quinn to be given money to pay contributors such as T.S. Eliot and Yeats and Wyndham Lewis and Joyce to contribute to the Little Review. So starting from March 1918, Joyce is sending chapters of the finished Ulysses to the Little Review. And no one has any sense of the scope of Ulysses at this time. Ultimately, Ulysses, as you know, is an extremely long novel. 267,000 words. It's one of the, kind of longest great novels of the... But Joyce says to Pound, I think it's the closing months of 1917, he says, I'm ready to consign it serially, which is uncharacteristically businesslike, in episodes of 6,000 words. Well, he gets going, and as soon as he, the episodes gradually get longer, Pound keeps on writing back quite appreciatively to begin with, saying, this is, he is so obviously enchanted by the early chapters of Ulysses. And so the serialization proceeds, and it begins, it begins well enough. The Egoist has trouble publishing it in London. Printers begin to object to some of the kind of more risky details in the early chapters of Ulysses, and they won't print Joyce.
Oh my goodness!
It's because they're liable under the Obscene Publications Act. Yeah, so they can't. They basically, a printer is liable, not the publisher. But Joyce's editors in New York, two women, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, are rather more kind of daring, more in tune with Joyce's aspirations, and so they say, they're quite prepared to take the risk with Ulysses and to publish it, and are very appreciative. In fact, what happens really, and it's kind of surprising, is that Pound objects to Ulysses more than his female editors in New York. So, Pound begins to cross details out from the typescripts before he sends them from London to New York.
So he is physically the intermediary?
He is an intermediary, yes, exactly. So he plays quite an important role. What's interesting about the serial text of Ulysses is that it's significantly different to the finished text.
All right.
So if you simply do a kind of what you could almost describe as a sort of junior school exercise, which is compare and contrast the two texts. What's chapter 1 like in its serial version? What's it like in its volume version? You begin to see small differences. As the work progresses, you see more and more differences. And certainly when you get to the big Leopold Bloom kind of psychological chapters, there are dramatic differences between the two texts. So one of the things the book is about the differences between those two. It's quite a good story. I mean, I would say quite a dry aspect of literary study is the study of textual variations. Though you're a romanticist, so I probably shouldn't say that. But in fact, in this case, actually, the critical case for studying the variation is quite strong.
We'll come back to the obscenity bit maybe in a minute. What actually about? I mean, the other thing that immediately strikes first-time readers, of course, of Ulysses is the illusion of punctuation. Does that change very much across the two texts, or because it's later in the book that it really gets extreme anyway, isn't it?
Yeah. Joyce is at an early stage in the serialization of the text committed to what you might call radical stylistic experiment. Nonetheless, as he revises the text for its volume form, the amount of stylistic experimentation definitely increases. Yeah. So one of the things in the book, towards the end of the book, because there's quite a thick layer of sort of literary history at the beginning, but the second part of the book is what you might call textual criticism or textual scholarship, and one part of it is a whole theory of what I've called, slightly belligerently, 7 types of Ulyssian revision. And that actually, what you've just asked me about, is one of what I've described as one of the types. So deepening the stylistic odyssey, or increasing stylistic complication, is very much a pattern in the way in which the text is revised post-serially.
Well, we'll try the other 6, but maybe we should maybe we should start with the obscenity bit. I mean, certainly in my period, copyright was tied to things like obscenity and blasphemy, and if you would lose your copyright if the text was thought obscene or thought blasphemous, is that an issue for you, for Joyce as well?
Yes, it is. We're into a kind of rather obscure aspect of American copyright law, but my understanding is that Joyce loses his copyright in Ulysses once it is deemed obscene by the New York court. So eventually,
that does happen in New York, yeah.
Yeah, eventually there is a case against the editors of the Little Review in February 1921, which brings the serialization to a halt. Long before Joyce has finished writing Ulysses. And I mean, one of the interesting things about that legal case, which is brought by the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, one of the interesting things about it is that who or what is on trial. You know, like what's being tried in the court, because you can't try a literary text. No. You know, like you can't kind of bring it. It hasn't got agency. You know, you can't. So there's an issue there.
So is it the two ladies who?
It's the two women. They are on trial. They are. You know, the charge is that they are guilty of publishing an obscene text. So what the judges have to determine is this particular part of Ulysses obscene within the statute, within the meaning of a particular statute. And, you know, it doesn't take them long to decide that to make the decision that it is. And that brings the end of the serialization. So that's February 1921. Joyce is by that stage living in Paris, and has a fairly vague understanding of what's really happening in New York, and never goes to America, by the way. This is one of the interesting things, because my book is in a way about what happens to Ulysses in America. Joyce never goes to America. So he has a fairly dim understanding of
what's happening to his text.
But once he hears about the result of the obscenity case, he very quickly makes arrangements with Sylvia Beach, who happens to be American, and who, in a sense, decides to champion Ulysses and to publish it exactly as he wishes under Shakespeare and Company. Not that much later, just over a year later, the text is published. And Joyce rewrites quite significantly in response to the obscenity judgment of, you know, so that's a kind of another argument in a way.
I could almost guess that he doesn't tone the obscenity down when he rewrites it, are we?
No, he doesn't. So that's another one of my, theories of kind of 7 types of Ulyssian revision, is that the work deemed explicit or, judged to be explicit becomes more explicit in revision. And, I mean, the evidence is really quite extensive. This actually revises something that, Joyce scholars have thought about Ulysses in the past. I mean, there's quite a strong tradition in American Joyce criticism to take the view that what Joyce does is he Homerizes Ulysses as he revises it, that he puts in more classical references in order to lessen the charge of obscenity and make it more overtly classical and more
high-flowing literary.
Yeah, and certainly Joyce does come up with this. I don't know if you're aware of the Schema.
Yes. To actually list, as it were, chapters against each other and so forth.
Yeah, that's right. So the Schema would be part of that argument, that actually Joyce is making the text more Homeric. But the the fact that the schema, the Linati schema, exists doesn't necessarily mean that Joyce has changed the shape of the work. It simply means that he's come up with this, which you could almost regard the schema as a bit of intelligent doodling. You don't necessarily have to take it as a sincere critical document. And Joyce, of course, doesn't want it to be circulated. He gives it to a select few people. And when Random House want it to be published, when Ulysses is finally being published in America in 1934, and they want to publish the schema, there's an extraordinary exchange of correspondence between Joyce and the publishers, where they say, well, we've got this schema, we'd like to put it in because we think it'll help people to understand Ulysses. And Joyce, Joyce's attitude is very much, over my dead body. No, the schema is not to be published. So it's quite a complicated set of arguments there.
Yes, that idea reminds me of Malcolm Lowry, I think, quoting Van Gogh and actually talking about a design governing posture, which might be useful for the writer, but is not actually necessary for the reader. Yeah. It's a kind of shape that's there, but you don't actually need to have it, need to see it. Maybe you shouldn't have it.
There's the sort of whole thing about the sociology of criticism, and why do we need to refer to the chapters of Ulysses by their Homeric titles, I've got here the first edition, facsimile, I should say, of the first edition. And it's quite interesting. If you look at it, one of the things that's kind of very noticeable to me bibliographically or textually or in terms of hermeneutics is an absolute absence of even chapter numbers. So Joyce certainly doesn't have a sense that you need to discuss this book in a particular way.
Yes, I'm sure my edition has the Homeric titles.
Yeah.
Interestingly, yes. Yeah, so that's interesting.
So this is kind of what it looks like. This is an American facsimile of the first edition. So this is what is what the thick book actually looked like. With its its famous cover. He insisted on the blue of the Greek flag and white lettering. It's quite a designed copy.
I didn't realise that, but that's handsome. It's handsome, and there you've also got a facsimile of the literal review.
Yeah. So these two, in a way, my book is about the difference between the Little Review and the 1920s. So in a way you could call them, they're both historic first editions. And what I've done is to write about the significance of these two historic first editions and the journey between the two. Yeah.
Well, it sounds absolutely fascinating. Give us these other how many have we got left? 4
7
or 5?
types, yeah. I have to say, if you're designing a critical argument, never make something with 7 types, because you always, if someone tries to get you in the pub to talk about them, you always forget some of them. But so it's a very fudgy category, but it does sort of work. One of the ideas is that Joyce is very interested in specificity. Cultural, historic, social, geographical, linguistic, political,
the kidneys.
Yeah, absolute kind of specificity of detail. And what you can see in the revision of the text is ever more detail going in. So it's a very kind of pronounced kind of habit of let's put more in. I've mentioned Lycidas. Let's put more Lycidas in. I've, more, that kind of thing. So there's a very, very interesting tendency towards the increase in specificity. I've mentioned making the work more sexually explicit. Revision of the text in alignment with the schema. So not necessarily making it more Homeric, but for example the Hades chapter, so chapter 6, which is set at a funeral, one of the things that you can see there is Joyce rewriting the chapter and putting in the word dead and death, like maybe 100 times. And you'd sort of think he can't possibly have done this, but it's like he's gone through Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, dug out every every phrase we use that has dead in it, like, dead as a doornail, in the midst of life we are in death, and he's put them into the text. So it's been quite sort of systematic. References to food in, chapter 8, Lestrygonians. So that's quite a big thing. So schematic additions is a big kind of type. Another thing which I found quite interesting is the thing about kind of embellishing micro-narrative. So the way Ulysses has got these tiny little stories, quite inconsequential stories, like, who delivers the milk? One of the facts about Leopold Bloom's life, actually quite moving, is the fact that his father has committed suicide. You could miss it quite easily in the absolute kind of plethora of detail, but when Joyce rewrites the text, he makes that story more prominent, so it's less easy to miss. So embellishing micro-narrative. There is one other thing that I think is worth talking about, because it's quite surprising, is intensification of kind of Hibernian elements. So, Joyce is obviously, committed to using Hiberno-English for quite dramatic literary effect. Hiberno-English in itself is quite a broad term, obviously, quite various. But you see, phrases of the Irish language, translated phrases of the Irish language being thrown in. And again, it's almost as though he's reached for a dictionary and thought, I've got to put in more. So, more proverbs, more Irishisms, more stage Irishry. And maybe you have to have Irish eyes to see that. But again, it's quite pronounced. So, and it's a revisionary impulse which is quite strongly associated with two speakers, Buck Mulligan and Simon Dedalus. Everything they say is quite funny, but when you look at the way they've been revised, on the whole, Joyce doesn't revise speech, but he does revise those two speakers. He comes back and he rewrites them, and they become sort of funnier and sadder in revision, and definitely more Hibernian. So that's that's quite a surprising. Because it's quite a significant aesthetic shift in the texture of the work.
And one wonders if there's a kind of introduction of a kind of slightly, I don't know whether it's ironic elegy in that linguistic shift.
But certainly I think the reception of the Irish literary revival and the reception of Synge has had an impact on the way Joyce is thinking about his position within the kind of literary firmament.
Yes.
So I think that could have a
yes, I suppose that's yes. I can see and the dates would work for that, wouldn't they? Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And also, what seems to have been the case is that once he got to Paris, he was no longer buried in kind of wartime Zurich or post-war Trieste. Once he's out of that, he's in Paris, he's in Shakespeare and Company. He has access to a much wider library of materials, and clearly kind of takes up reading in multiple directions. Obviously he's always been a kind of bookaholic, but I think he has access to material which is more specific.
Which you wouldn't have for the little review.
Didn't have easily. Couldn't quite so easily access, particularly in Trieste.
Clare, the book does sound absolutely fascinating. It'll take me back to Ulysses apart from anything else. And thanks very much for talking to us.